You've been lied to about King Arthur your entire life. Everything you think you know wrong, and I'm about to prove it. Look, we've all heard the stories. The Sword in the Stone, Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin doing magic tricks. It's the stuff of legends, right? But here's the thing nobody talks about. Was King Arthur even real? And if he wasn't, why has this story survived for over 1,000 years? What's the truth hiding beneath all those shiny swords and noble quests? Today we're going deep. We're talking ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and some seriously weird historical mysteries that'll make you question everything you learned in school. Because the real story? It's way more interesting than the fairy tale. So let's start with the obvious question. Did King Arthur actually exist? And honestly, this is where things get complicated fast. Because unlike other historical figures where we can point to birth certificates or tax records or whatever, Arthur exists in this strange grey area between history and myth. There's no smoking gun, no tomb with his name on it, no contemporary accounts saying, "Yeah, I met Arthur last Tuesday, nice guy." But here's where it gets interesting. The complete absence of evidence doesn't mean he didn't exist. It just means we have to dig deeper. And when historians started doing exactly that, they found something fascinating. Not proof of Arthur, but proof of the world that could have created the legend. Let's go back to the 5th and 6th centuries. Britain is a complete mess. The Romans have packed up and left after 400 years of occupation. Suddenly, all these different groups are fighting for control. You've got the native Britons who've been there forever. You've got Saxon invaders coming from what's now Germany. You've got conflicts everywhere. It's basically Game of Thrones, but with worse hygiene. Now here's the thing about this period. Historians call it the Dark Ages for a reason. We have almost no written records from Britain during this time. The literacy that the Romans brought, gone. The organized record-keeping, gone. It's like someone hit the delete button on an entire century of history. But absence of records doesn't mean nothing happened. People were still living, fighting, loving, dying. Leaders were still rising and falling. And somewhere in all that chaos, something happened that was memorable enough to echo through the centuries. The first actual mention of Arthur in any historical text doesn't appear until around 830 AD. That's roughly 300 years after he supposedly lived. A Welsh monk named Nennius writes this text called the Historia Brittonum, and in it he lists 12 battles fought by a warrior named Arthur against the Saxons. Not a king, mind you, a war leader, a military commander who won impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Nennius describes Arthur carrying the image of the Virgin Mary on his shoulders during the Battle of Badon, where he supposedly killed 960 men single-handedly. Now, obviously, that's exaggerated. Nobody's killing that many people alone. But here's what's interesting. The Battle of Badon is mentioned in other sources too. Earlier sources. Sources that don't mention Arthur at all, but confirm that a major battle happened around 500 AD, where the Britons absolutely crushed the Saxons. So we have a real battle. We have other Welsh texts from around the same period mentioning someone named Arthur in passing. We have fragments, pieces, but nothing definite. Then we get to the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh annals, written around 970 AD. This text mentions Arthur twice, first at the Battle of Badon in 516 AD, then at the Battle of Camelot in 537 AD, where Arthur and Mordred both fell. That's it. 2 lines, no context, no explanation, just these brief mentions that feel like the writer assumed everyone already knew who Arthur was. Now here's where the myth really takes off. In 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth writes the Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, and this book changes everything. Geoffrey takes whatever fragments existed about Arthur and turns them into a full-blown epic. Suddenly, Arthur isn't just a war leader. He's a king. He has a magical sword called Excalibur. He has a wizard advisor named Merlin. He conquers half of Europe. He has a round table. He has a beautiful capital called Caerleon. Geoffrey's book is a massive hit. It spreads across Europe. Everyone's reading it, everyone's copying it, and everyone's adding their own details. French writers add Lancelot and the quest for the Holy Grail. They add the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. German writers add their own knights and adventures. The story grows and grows until it's this massive interconnected web of tales that barely resembles whatever small truth might have started it all. But here's the million-dollar question. Why did Geoffrey write this book? And this is where some historians think they've figured something out. Geoffrey was writing during a very specific time in history. The Norman conquest of England had happened about 70 years earlier. The Normans, who were basically French Vikings, had taken over England and were trying to legitimize their rule. They needed a glorious British past to connect themselves to. They needed legendary kings and noble warriors to make their conquest seem like they were continuing some grand tradition. So was Geoffrey just making it all up? Was he creating propaganda for his Norman overlords? Maybe, but probably not entirely. Because woven throughout his fantastical tale are these little details that seem to come from somewhere. Place names that match real locations, battle sites that align with archaeological evidence of conflict, cultural details about the Britons that wouldn't make sense unless he had access to older sources. Let's talk about the archaeological evidence, because this is where things get really interesting. For years, archaeologists dismissed the Arthur story as complete fiction. Then, in the 1960s, they started excavating a site called Tintagel Castle in Cornwall. According to legend, this is where Arthur was conceived through Merlin's magical trickery. The archaeologists weren't looking for Arthur. They were just studying medieval ruins. But they found something unexpected. Beneath the medieval castle, they found evidence of a massive Dark Age settlement. We're talking about a wealthy, important site with connections to the Mediterranean. They found pottery from North Africa and Turkey. They found evidence of wine imports. This wasn't some backwater, this was a major power center during exactly the period when Arthur supposedly lived. Then in 1998, they found something even more interesting. A piece of slate with a Latin inscription that included the name Artognu, not Arthur, but close, really close. The inscription dates to the 6th century. Some scholars jumped on this as proof that Arthur was real. Others pointed out that Artognu was a fairly common name in Celtic Britain, and finding one example doesn't prove anything about a legendary king. But here's what's undeniable. Tintagel was clearly an important place during the Dark Ages. Whether or not Arthur lived there, someone powerful did. Someone with enough wealth and connections to import luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. Someone who could have been the kind of leader that legends get built around. Similar patterns show up at other sites associated with Arthur. Cadbury Castle in Somerset, identified in medieval times as the real Camelot, shows massive refortification during the late 5th century. Someone spent enormous resources rebuilding those defenses. Someone was preparing for war. Someone was organizing resistance against the Saxon invasion. And here's another fascinating detail. The name Arthur itself, it's not a British name, it's Roman. It comes from Artorius, a Roman family name. There was actually a Roman commander named Lucius Artorius Castus, who served in Britain in the 2nd century, leading cavalry units against northern tribes. Some historians think the Arthur legend might be a confused memory of this earlier Roman commander mixed with later British war leaders. But other historians point out that in the 5th and 6th centuries some British leaders were still using Roman names as a way of connecting themselves to the prestige of Rome. Having a Roman name didn't make you Roman. It made you someone claiming Roman authority and civilization against the barbarian invaders. So here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, someone, maybe named Arthur, maybe not, led the Britons to significant victories against the Saxon invaders. This person, or these people, slowed the Saxon conquest for a generation or two. They became heroes. Their stories were told and retold. And over the centuries, those stories grew and changed and absorbed elements from other myths and legends until they became the Arthur story we know today. But why did this particular story survive when so many others didn't? Why did Arthur become the legendary king while other historical figures faded into obscurity? And this is where we get into some really interesting cultural analysis. The Arthur legend survives because it's adaptable. It's a story that can be reshaped to fit whatever values a society holds dear. In medieval times, Arthur represented Christian kingship and chivalric values. During the Victorian era, Arthur became a symbol of British imperial destiny. In modern times, he's been reimagined as everything from a historical warlord to a space-age hero. The core story, the rightful king, the noble warriors, the fight against impossible odds, is flexible enough to work in almost any context. And there's something else. The Arthur story is fundamentally about loss, about a golden age that existed once and was destroyed. Camelot falls, Arthur dies, the Round Table scatters, but there's always this promise that Arthur will return when Britain needs him most. He's not dead, just sleeping, waiting. That's a powerful myth. Every culture has some version of it. The hero who will return in the darkest hour, the golden age that might come again. It speaks to something deep in human psychology. This hope that no matter how bad things get, salvation is possible. Let's talk about some of the specific elements of the Arthur legend and where they might have come from, because this stuff is wild. The sword in the stone, where does that come from? Some historians think it might be a confused memory of ancient Celtic ceremonies where new kings were inaugurated by pulling a sword from a sacred stone or anvil. Others think it might be connected to medieval sword-making techniques where blades were partially embedded in stone for tempering. The earliest versions of the Arthur story don't actually include the sword in the stone. That gets added later. Excalibur itself. The name probably comes from the Welsh Camelot, which appears in early Welsh poetry connected to Arthur. But magical swords are common in Celtic and Germanic mythology. Arthur's sword might be borrowing from much older traditions of heroes with legendary weapons. The Round Table. This is a Geoffrey of Monmouth edition, and it's genius. By making the table round, Arthur creates equality among his knights. No one sits at the head. Everyone is equally important. This is revolutionary thinking for medieval times when hierarchy was everything. Merlin. He's probably based on a semi-legendary Welsh prophet named Merlin who lived in the 6th century and supposedly went mad after a battle. Geoffrey took this figure and transformed him into Arthur's magical advisor. But the idea of kings having mystical counselors is ancient. It appears in cultures around the world. The Holy Grail. This doesn't appear in the Arthur legends until the late 12th century, when French writer Chrétien de Troyes introduces it. He probably borrowed the idea from Celtic myths about magical cauldrons. Then later writers Christianized it, making it the cup from the Last Supper. Lancelot. Also a French addition. The British versions of Arthur don't include him at all. He's created to add romantic drama and to explore themes of loyalty versus love. The whole Lancelot-Guinevere affair is basically medieval soap opera, but it raises interesting questions about what happens when personal desire conflicts with social duty. Here's my take. Based on everything historians and archaeologists have found, there was probably a real person or group of people who inspired the Arthur legend. They were war leaders during the late 5th and early 6th centuries who successfully resisted Saxon expansion for a generation. They were probably based in the west of Britain, maybe in Wales or Cornwall, or possibly in the north, near Hadrian's Wall. They won significant victories, including possibly the Battle of Badon, which genuinely was a major defeat for the Saxons. These victories bought the Britons time and became the stuff of immediate legend. Stories about these leaders were passed down orally for generations, growing and changing with each telling. When those stories finally got written down, centuries later, they'd absorbed elements from Celtic mythology, Christian theology, and the political needs of medieval writers. The historical core, if it existed, was buried under layers of additions and embellishments. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth got his hands on the story, it was impossible to separate fact from fiction. But here's what's beautiful about the Arthur legend. It doesn't matter if he was real. The story has become real through its impact on culture. Arthur represents something that resonates across centuries and cultures. The idea that heroism matters, that good leaders can hold back chaos at least for a while, that even in the darkest times resistance is possible. The Arthur legend shaped medieval literature, inspired crusades, influenced how we think about kings and knights and chivalry. It's been adapted into hundreds of books, movies, TV shows, video games. It continues to evolve and change, just like it always has. So is King Arthur real? Maybe. Probably. Sort of. The historical reality, some war leader or leaders who fought the Saxons, was real enough. But the Arthur we know, the Arthur of Camelot and the Round Table and Excalibur, that Arthur is a collective creation, built over centuries by storytellers and poets and propagandists and dreamers. The untold truth behind King Arthur's myth isn't that he was secretly real or secretly fake. It's that the question misses the point entirely. Arthur exists in that fascinating space between history and imagination, and that's exactly where legends belong. Think about it this way. We have tons of evidence for various Roman emperors. We know exactly when they lived, what they did, how they died. But nobody tells stories about Honorius or Valentinian thread anymore. They were real, but they're forgotten. Arthur might not have been real in the way they were real, but his story has outlived them all by 1,000 years. That's the power of myth. That's why these stories matter, not because they're historically accurate documentaries about the past, but because they're living stories that evolve with us, that help us make sense of the world, that give us frameworks for understanding heroism and failure and everything in between. So the next time someone asks you if King Arthur was real, you can tell them the truth. He's as real as we need him to be. And after 1,500 years of stories, he's not going anywhere. If you want more deep dives into historical mysteries, hit subscribe.